So in this session, we're going to cover the load forecasts and producing the load forecasts and interpreting them. And because we're basing this on a probabilistic method, it actually requires a bit more explanation. And overall, it's a data-intensive process. Takes a while when you hit the button to run. It's still less than 2 minutes. But here we're going to focus more so on interpreting the results overall. Our case example is going to be the RDRJ load. And we intentionally set the design ratings lower than they should be, just to illustrate a couple points. So in practice, you have quite a bit more capacity available, than is listed here. But we wanted to kind of illustrate some key concepts since, bigger infrastructure investments don't happen on a regular basis. Quick reminder, before you get to producing load forecast, you have to load the input models, clean the data, analyze the load patterns, and then you can click produce load forecast. Or alternatively, you can run everything at once and go grab a cup of coffee and come back. Right here, we're going to shift over to the results and kind of walk through them step by step in the interpretation of those results. So at a high level, there are 6 primary sets of results that we have. The forecast of growth with uncertainty, and this is just the growth in itself. Then we have a likelihood of exceeding ratings, the impact of weather uncertainty, the low duration curves by forecast year, and they come in 2 flavors. One is the 1 in 10, and one is the 1 in 2, which we have 2 versions of them. And then we have the peak day load forecast by forecast year. So the first step that the model really goes through, it starts by producing what is, in essence, the growth forecast. We start off with the historical analysis and look and peg the last year of data as being the year 0, where we are at 100% of a growth factor. And from there on out, the model essentially runs these trajectories, it simulates these trajectories on top of each other. So if your load is declining 1 year, chances are you're going to have a decline the next year, but there's a random component to it. And that builds in the year before. So over time, it's a cumulative effect, and whatever path you take, it leads you down a different path overall. But this is essentially a summary that is looking at, here's the growth trajectories. It doesn't include uncertainty in the weather. It just simply says, well, here you can grow, and here's the most likely pathways or results that you're going to have on a year-by-year basis. So it has a funnel effect, because the further you go out, the more uncertainty you have. And there's a few key components in the chart, obviously the growth factor and the year, but the line is your expected value, or what would typically be your linear forecast. The band that's blue covers 50% of the simulated trajectories. The band that is kind of purplish or lilac covers 90% of the trajectories. Then we have the boundaries that say, here's what 98% of the results are. Now, in practice, yeah, I think I skipped that. So in practice, you can take a look at this, but you'll ultimately care about not just what the growth is. You want to incorporate the uncertainty of the weather as well. And that depends on what scenario you're running. In the inputs, you have the option to run the results for the forecast using a probabilistic weather year, which essentially says, I don't know what the weather will be in 2017 or 2018 or 2019. I'm going to basically pick a weather pattern that we saw in the past at random for a given year and insert it for that year. So that approach really incorporates the variability in weather that we have as a whole. The other 2 options are to pick a 1 in 2, or often called a P50 year, which essentially picks a year that was classified as having normal weather. And then you have a 1 in 10, or P90, which is a year that had extreme weather. But for the latter approaches, whether it's 1 in 2 or 1 in 10, you basically use exactly the same weather every single year in the simulation, so that you're going to be looking just at growth rates. But it has the advantage that it fixes one component that's pretty uncertain, which is weather. So in the forecast summary tab, that is illustrated actually down here in the third main component, which is the impact of the weather uncertainty. We covered this a little bit in the overview of probabilistic planning, but in essence, this is a chart that shows peak days based on current load patterns, where we substituted the weather from historical weather years. So really just all we did is change the weather year. It's the same underlying energy use patterns that we're seeing today, but under different weather conditions that we've seen in the past. And as a whole, for each of these days, we pick here's the peak year or the peak day overall. And it shows the range of uncertainty that you have when you pay attention to year-by-year weather. If you have an extreme year, your load can be substantially higher than if you have a relatively cool year by an order of magnitude. So weather has a key effect on the uncertainty of the results. So to see this, this is actually illustrated right below here when we look at the annual peak forecast confidence bands. This top one was just simply showing here's the growth if weather's held constant. This chart right here is factoring in, here's the growth, but on top of that, here's the weather uncertainty that we underlying some of the load forecast. And it's a substantial amount of uncertainty, which is why when we get down to year one, right, overall, we see bands around it, just simply because there's uncertainty in terms of what the weather will be. And as the further you go out, the more the uncertainty and growth begins to dominate. So that's the core concept. We do this for the annual peak. We also show a different chart. And this one requires a little bit more interpretation. It's essentially saying here's the likelihood that we will have loads above the risk tolerance level. So conceptually, what we're looking at here is for every single simulation and for every single year, we look at a load duration curve. And we'll go back to historical analysis where we have that. Actually, we look at a load duration curve and identify what the load was at, for example, for 6% of the hours. So if I look at a load duration curve, they're further down here, and I look at the percentage of hours, let's say I have a risk tolerance of 6% of hours, for every single year, I'm going to look at what is my MVA value at 6% of hours. And what this chart is showing is here's the result of the 5,000 simulations in this case, and, for the particular value. And it's very instructive because this is really the value that is critical in looking at your infrastructure upgrade decisions, is the degree to which, frequency at which you're exceeding the long-term emergency rating and whether you're still within an acceptable level of risk. So same concept, different metric. This one is the annual peak is much more relevant if you're looking at transmission, where you have to be concerned about short-term emergency ratings. If you're looking at distribution projects, you really care about the long-term emergency ratings. And this second chart is the key one because it really is depicting here's the load at the risk threshold that we care about. The next chart is essentially the likelihood of exceeding different types of ratings. So given the inputs that we put in, again, we faked having less capacity at this location than what we actually have in practice. The chances that the design rating or the long-term emergency rating will exceed are relatively high, but you're very unlikely to exceed it by more than 6% of hours, which is really the risk tolerance. You can see, however, that the likelihood of exceeding the risk tolerance grows up as you go further and further into the future. So by the time you get to 2025, you have about a 60% chance that you're going to exceed the risk tolerance. Whereas if you look at 2020, it's about a 20% chance. So this is a key factor, and it's really the result of all the simulations. In this instance, the likelihood you're going to exceed the short-term emergency rating is nil. That doesn't happen very often. you typically are going to violate the risk tolerance level before you get to the short-term emergency rating, but that is not always the case. We already covered the impact of weather uncertainty, so we're not going to go over that again. What we're going to shift over is talk about load duration curves. So these are load duration curves by forecast year, and they are essentially, in this case, summarizing what's a normal year or a 1 and 2 weather year, or a P50, depending on the terminology you use. We drew in here the summer rating and the short-term emergency rating, in the chart, and in essence go through and show the full load duration curve as a whole, and then we have a version that zooms in on the top 10% of hours. Now both of these are instructive because one, it tells us that the loads are growing in the simulations, and it tells us whether we're exceeding a particular threshold. In this case, for short-term emergency, we care about the peak. For the summer, the LTE rating or the summer rating in this case, we care about the risk threshold, which is the 6% of hours that you would exceed. So you can see here under a 1 and 2 condition, we will probably start violating the long-term emergency rating and have bigger risk than is acceptable in roughly 2021 in this example. By the time we get to 22, we're clearly above it, and going forward from there. So there's a 1 and 2 condition. Now we have the same set of charts for a much more extreme component where we combined two pieces. One is an extreme year and growth that is higher than the forecasted average. So basically it's in the upper end of the growth, and we have extreme weather year. Now you can consider this an extreme case, but it's something that is useful to review in terms of the analysis. And again, we have the same chart showing the full load duration curve with the MVA, but probably the more relevant one is saying, here's the forecast MVA, here's the thresholds, and really here is the likelihood that we're going to violate, exceed the tolerable risk, which is, or the long-term emergency rating, which in this case is 6% of hours. You can kind of see it happening relatively quickly. Looking at the lines, it looks like it's around 2019 overall, or 2018 that you start exceeding that, and you need to potentially do something relatively quickly if you had this rating at that location. The last few charts are simply looking at load duration curves. I mean, not load duration curves, but hourly load on the peak days. And again, we have it for the 1 and 2 weather year and the 1 and 10 weather year. You can see the difference between the 1 and 2 and the 1 and 10. It's actually quite severe in terms of the weather itself, and just a different load pattern because of the weather that we saw in those years and in those days. And that's it in terms of the forecasting. It gives you some pretty useful feedback. We will eventually incorporate a button here that allows you to produce the 8760 forecast with uncertainty for 5 years out. But that requires a bit more crunching. It's actually part of the DCEP process. But overall, it gives you pretty intuitive insights in terms of the risk that you're looking at and the likelihood of exceeding the design ratings. Ideally, it's helpful in terms of determining whether or not you need to take action or not. So with that, we're going to shift over and start talking about value, and really what's the value of the T&D deferral, or potentially using something besides wires options in terms of trying to manage that particular the load so they don't exceed key design criteria.